London Preston was on the verge of tears when she realized the groom wasn't coming, alone at the altar, in an absurdly expensive dress, wilting flowers in her hands, and 200 guests watching with pity. Then someone stood up. Brian Holman, the man she'd hated since college. He walked toward her with that insufferable smile on his lips. London expected humiliation, mockery, him savoring her lowest moment. But Brian took her hand and whispered, "Pretend to be my wife." London froze. Why was he doing this? Saving her when her defeat should have been everything he enjoyed. But right there in that moment of pure desperation, she said yes, with absolutely no idea what kind of mess she was getting herself into. Chapter 1. The Groom Who Vanished. London. Preston had been standing at the altar for a quarter of an hour, and the groom was nowhere to be found. Under normal circumstances, that would have been merely awkward, but with 200 guests watching every agonizing second unfold, it was a full-blown catastrophe. Father Matthews had already cleared his throat more times than anyone could count. The organist had looped back to the processional twice. Brandon's mother had excused herself for some fresh air and never come back. Every sign pointed to one devastating conclusion. London had dialed Brandon 6 times. Straight to voicemail every single call. The realization landed in her gut like a stone. He'd bolted, left her standing there like a fool wrapped in ridiculously expensive French lace, clutching peonies that were dying a little more with each passing minute. And then Brian Holman stood up. He rose from his seat in the middle of that unbearable silence and walked down the aisle as if this were the most natural thing in the world. London's pulse spiked, panic laced with fury, because out of every person in that church, Brian was the absolute last one she wanted witnessing her downfall. 4 years of college, 4 years of despising this man, who showed up late to everything, who irritated her simply by breathing, who she'd humiliated at graduation with a vicious crack about the size of his manhood. Brian stopped right in front of her, impeccable suit, infuriating grin. He took her hand and leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "Be my wife." London stared at him. "Are you brain damaged?" "Very possible. But here's the thing, London, you've got 2 choices right now." His grip on her hand tightened, and beneath the easy smile there was something urgent, almost desperate. "You either stand here and let this become the defining moment of your life, or you marry me and walk out of here with your head up. Decide now. Everyone's staring and this is getting painful." "Why on earth would I marry you?" she hissed, heat crawling up her neck. "Because I'm the only idiot in this room willing to rescue your perfectionist ass, and frankly, you still owe me for that whole graduation stunt." His smile didn't waver, but his eyes were dead serious. "Yes or no?" London glanced around, her mother frozen in the front pew. Ava in the second row, phone raised, recording with the gleeful expression of someone watching a reality show finale. 200 faces, waiting for her next move. She thought about Brandon, who'd abandoned her without a word. She thought about walking back down that aisle alone, defeated, broken, and something stubborn and reckless inside her, the part that never backed down when cornered, made the decision. "Yes," she said. Her own voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. The church erupted into chaos, but Brian just smiled wider and turned to Father Matthews. "Father, let's move this along before she comes to her senses. Same ceremony. Just swap Brandon's name for mine." "That is absolutely not how this works," the priest sputtered. $50,000 to the church says otherwise. Brian pulled a check from his jacket pocket with the calm of a man ordering coffee. Father Matthews stared at the check. He appeared to have a brief negotiation with his conscience. He lost. May God have mercy on us all. "Brian Holman, do you take London Preston to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Brian said without a beat of hesitation. "London Preston, do you take—" "She said yes already," Brian cut in. "Rings! I got rings!" Jared Cooper, Brian's best friend, came sprinting down the aisle holding 2 ring pops, those ridiculous candy rings from childhood, and the entire scene tipped from surreal into outright absurdity. Brian chose the red one and slipped it onto London's finger with a gentleness that caught her off guard. "Cherry, always been your favorite." London looked down at the candy ring, then up at him, and something clenched tight behind her ribs. How the hell did he remember that after a decade? "Kiss her," someone hollered from the crowd. Brian turned to London with a look that was asking, genuinely asking, even in the middle of all this madness. "Can I?" London grabbed his tie and pulled him in. The kiss was brief, technically innocent, but something crackled between them. Raw electricity tangled up with the memory of every almost that had come before. When they broke apart, Brian murmured against her ear, "Welcome to the most insane wedding in New York history." "I hate you," London whispered. "I know." He spun toward the congregation and threw his arms wide. "Ladies and gentlemen, my wife." Their history stretched back over a decade, to the day Brian strolled into their first business ethics lecture 20 minutes late, dropped into the seat next to hers, and proceeded to borrow paper, a pen, pen and then shamelessly copy her quiz answers, as though that were a perfectly reasonable thing to do. What followed was 4 years of relentless war. He blew deadlines on group projects, she called him out in front of professors, he plastered absurd sticky notes all over her car, she hacked into his presentation slides and filled them with pictures of kittens. But underneath the hostility, there was a current neither of them acknowledged. Junior year, at a Halloween party, too many drinks erased the usual defenses. They danced so close the room dissolved around them. He leaned in, she leaned in, inches apart, and then his ex appeared in tears and he was gone, leaving London standing there alone, feeling foolish and stung. At graduation, they locked eyes across the crowd with a tension so thick it was almost visible, until Ava shrieked, "Photo!" and shattered the moment. The final blow landed at the post-graduation party. Brian, half drunk and visibly raw, asked her out in front of everyone they knew. London Preston, go out with me. For real this time. London, equally drunk and furious that it had taken him 4 years to finally say it, answered loud enough for the entire room to hear. Brian, I'd rather date a guy with a tiny dick. Oh wait, that's basically the same thing as dating you. Dead silence. Then an explosion of laughter. Brian went red in a way she'd never seen before. You literally have no evidence of that. I don't need any. Everything about you screams overcompensation. He looked at her for a long, still moment. Something behind his eyes flickered and went out. Then he turned and walked away. And that was the last real conversation they had for 3 years, until today. The reception, all things considered, turned out surprisingly well for a party celebrating a clinically insane wedding. Open bar was open bar, and 200 guests were more than happy to lean into the chaos. London managed about 15 minutes of fragile calm before the weight of everything crashed down on her, and she hauled Brian into a quiet corner. Talk, she said. Why did you do that? The grin disappeared. He looked at her with an honesty that didn't fit the circus happening around them. Because watching you fall apart up there wasn't something I could do, London. You were about to cry. That piece of shit left you and I couldn't sit there and let it happen. But marriage, Brian, we are legally married now. On paper, he shrugged with maddening nonchalance. We file for annulment Monday morning. Duress, unusual circumstances. Done. Easy. Something shifted in London's chest. Relief, maybe, or something uncomfortably close to disappointment. She didn't examine it too closely. Fine. Good. But until Monday, he caught her hand and steered her back toward the crowd. We are husband and wife, so we might as well enjoy it. Dance. Eat that obscenely expensive cake you picked out. Have some fun for once. You think this qualifies as fun? I think you qualify as fun, Brian said, pulling her onto the dance floor. Always have, London. You're my favorite person to drive crazy, and tonight I saved your life, so just say thank you and dance with me. Against every shred of logic and self-preservation she possessed, London smiled. Thank you. You absolute moron. You're welcome, my impossibly uptight wife. They danced, and for the first time in 10 years they didn't fight, not once. When the song ended, Brian held on for one extra beat before letting go. The rest of the night dissolved into champagne and laughter and stolen glances, and there were moments when London could almost convince herself none of it was pretend. Around 1 in the morning, as the last guests trickled out, Brian appeared at her side. You booked a bridal suite, didn't you? London's stomach tightened. I did. For me and Brandon, who, by the way, blocked my number. What a gentleman, Brian said, his voice edged with contempt. Listen, I'll grab another room. You take the suite. Monday we deal with the paperwork. She should have agreed. But the thought of rattling around that enormous suite alone on what was supposed to be her wedding night felt unbearable, and Brian had been unexpectedly decent all evening. There are 2 king beds in the suite and you dropped 50 grand on a priest today. The least I can do is split the room. Platonically. Brian's eyebrow arched, and there it was. That insufferable smirk. London Preston inviting me to her room, sharing a room like reluctant roommates, she corrected, biting back a grin she couldn't fully suppress. Strictly platonic, he agreed, though his eyes were bright with amusement. Just 2 people who happened to have gotten married a few hours ago. Totally normal evening. He offered his arm. London took it and let him lead her out into the night, thinking that this was without question the strangest ending to a wedding day anyone had ever experienced. But given how it had started, maybe strange was exactly what she needed. Chapter 2. The Pretend Marriage. That hits too close. The reception had gone far better than anyone had a right to expect, given that it was technically a celebration of the most unhinged wedding in Manhattan history. But London figured that a premium open bar had the supernatural ability to make people overlook minor details, like the original groom fleeing the scene and being replaced mid-ceremony by the bride's sworn enemy. The guests had transitioned from stunned silence to enthusiastic participation the moment the DJ dropped Beyoncé and the Salmon Wellington hit the tables. At the end of the day, people had their priorities, and expensive food paired with unlimited free drinks outranked any matrimonial scandal. Diane Preston had suffered a minor meltdown in the bathroom around 10 o'clock, but Ava intervened with a potent combination of champagne and merciless pragmatism. 15 minutes later, London's mother emerged and announced, loudly enough for 3 surrounding tables to hear, that Brian Holman had far superior financial prospects than Brandon ever did, and that she'd always sensed something untrustworthy about a man that uptight. London nearly choked on an oyster. Diane had spent 8 solid months worshipping Brandon as the ideal son-in-law, and now she was championing Brian like he'd been the obvious choice from the start. Ava's maid of honor toast was a work of art. Ruthless public humiliation dressed up as heartfelt sentiment. She climbed onto the stage, gripping a champagne glass in each hand, apparently requiring bilateral support for what she was about to deliver, and opened with a grenade. Dear guests, love finds you in the most unexpected places, like say in the middle of your own catastrophic public humiliation in front of 200 people, including your annoying aunt and that mystery cousin nobody remembers inviting, but who's demolishing the shrimp like it's his last meal on Earth. The room erupted. Ava pressed on without mercy. I've known London since college, and I can personally confirm that this woman spent 4 years talking about Brian Holman non-stop. Before she murders me, I should clarify that the conversations were more along the lines of, I'm going to shove his face into his overdue project, not I like him. She paused, letting a wicked grin settle onto her face. But here's what everyone knew except the 2 of them. You don't spend 4 years fixated on someone you claim to hate unless you're actually fixated on someone you love, but are too damn stubborn to admit it. So here's to Brian for pulling off the most insane and somehow romantic gesture by saving London today. And here's to London for finally getting out of her own way. You two are a disaster, but you're a perfect disaster. Cheers. Now it was past 1 in the morning. The reception was officially over, the last lingering guests gently ushered out by hotel staff, and London stood in the marble and gold lobby beside Brian, feeling the full weight of what came next settling into her stomach. During the party, she'd managed to treat the whole thing as a wild, surreal celebration, but now came the part every wedding inevitably reaches, the moment the newlyweds go somewhere private together. So, London began, staring at a point somewhere beyond Brian's shoulder. I had the bridal suite reserved, for me and, well, Brandon the fugitive. Brian finished flatly. Speaking of, any sign of life from him? London checked her phone on reflex and felt a fresh wave of anger. Nothing, he blocked my number. Spectacular, Brian said, his voice sharp with contempt. Really first-class behavior. Abandons his own wedding and then blocks the bride like she's some unhinged ex. The man deserves a Lifetime Achievement Award in cowardice. London let out a hollow laugh. Brian shoved his hands into his pockets, his expression straining for casual and not quite getting there. Listen, about tonight, I already checked with the front desk. There's a room open on the 12th floor. I can take that. You keep the suite. Clean, simple, no awkwardness. She should have said yes immediately. It was the rational choice, the one that maintained appropriate boundaries. But the thought of spending the night alone in an enormous suite designed for 2 felt crushingly bleak. And Brian had been unexpectedly good all evening, making her laugh when she should have been crying, being exactly the kind of presence she hadn't known she needed. The suite has 2 beds, London said, before her better judgment could intervene, both king size, and given that you bribed a priest with a small fortune and kept me sane through the entire party, and covered every bill tonight, the least I can do is share. Brian's eyebrow went up, and that maddening grin appeared. London Preston is officially inviting me to her room, to share the room, London corrected immediately, platonically, like reluctant roommates who happen to have gotten married for completely deranged reasons. Oh, absolutely platonic, Brian agreed, though his tone made it obvious he found the entire situation deeply entertaining. Without question, the suite was aggressively romantic, and London froze in the doorway, absorbing the sheer absurdity. Red rose petals trailed across the floor in a deliberate path toward the main living area. A bottle of Dom Perignon sat chilling in a silver bucket. Scented candles threw soft, intimate light across every surface. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a glittering panorama of nighttime Manhattan, and there they were, 2 king-size beds, side by side, as though anticipating a couple that liked to keep their options open. Well, Brian let out a low whistle as he stepped in behind her. Brandon had taste in sweets, I'll give him that. Catastrophic judgment and zero backbone, but the man could book a room. I picked the suite, London corrected, yanking off her veil and hurling it onto the white sofa with more force than necessary. Brandon wanted to save money and go to a Holiday Inn. I insisted on this. Then here's to your stubbornness, because this is spectacular, Brian said, drifting toward the windows to take in the view. London kicked off the heels that had been slowly destroying her feet for hours and felt a wave of pure physical relief. I hate him. Understandable. No, I genuinely hate him. she went on. Who does that? Who plans an entire wedding? Chooses the flowers, tastes every cake sample, sends 200 invitations and then just doesn't show up, without so much as a text. A coward, Brian said, turning to face her. Someone who never deserved you. London went still. You actually believe that? London, you're overbearing, controlling and perfectionist to a degree that probably warrants clinical intervention, Brian said with unflinching honesty. But you're also extraordinary, brilliant, funny, loyal past the point of reason. Anyone too blind to see that doesn't deserve your time, let alone your heart. Something clenched tight behind her ribs, and she looked away before he could read too much in her expression. Brian reached for the champagne and filled 2 glasses. We should toast. To what exactly? To catastrophes that turn into something slightly less catastrophic. He handed her a glass with that crooked half smile. To us, the most improbable couple in the city. London accepted the glass and lifted it with a flicker of defiance. To you, for rescuing me from a lifetime of shame. Anytime, Brian said, and something in the way he said it made her pulse stutter. They drank. A comfortable silence settled between them, but London could feel a question smoldering in her chest, demanding to be asked. Why did you really do this? No deflecting, no sarcasm. I want the truth. Brian lowered himself onto the sofa and patted the cushion beside him. Sit down. This one needs some setup. London sat, keeping a deliberate gap between them, and waited. You want honest? Yes. I couldn't stand watching you break, he said quietly. That's the whole answer. London, you drive me out of my mind, but you didn't deserve that. And I don't know, instinct maybe. Temporary insanity. A sly grin crept across his face. Or maybe part of me always wanted to marry you, just to definitively prove that I am not under-equipped. London choked on her champagne mid-sip. Brian, you're the one who put that narrative into the universe. He was laughing for real now, that deep, unguarded laugh she'd rarely heard. But honestly, I couldn't let it happen. Not to you, never to you. London wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, scrambling to recover some shred of composure. Thank you. Truly, it was certifiably insane, but thank you. You're welcome, wife. Don't call me that. Why not? Brian asked with exaggerated innocence. Technically, that's exactly what you are, for at least 48 hours until we file for annulment Monday. 2 days, London murmured. And we can survive 2 days of being married. Want to bet on that? He extended his hand, challenge glinting in his eyes. Bet. She shook it, and then neither of them let go. Their hands stayed linked, eyes locked, and the air between them thickened into something almost tangible. Brian spoke first. London, don't, she cut in. I haven't said anything yet. You were about to say something reckless, London said, but noticed she still hadn't released his hand. I know that look. What I was going to say, Brian began, leaning slightly closer, is that you look beautiful, even after a day of total chaos. Even though you hate the dress, you're stunning. Her heartbeat kicked into a dangerous rhythm. Brian, don't make this complicated. It's already complicated, he said softly. It was complicated the second I said I do. His free hand came up and brushed her cheek. London, just tonight, we can pretend this is real, that we chose each other. And in the morning we deal with reality, he said, his thumb tracing a slow line along her jaw. But right now you're my wife and I'm your husband. Can we just have this? London should have said no. It was the logical, sensible, self-preserving answer. Instead, she grabbed a fistful of his shirt and pulled him into a kiss. Nothing like the restrained press of lips at the church. This was desperate and consuming, and 10 years of unresolved tension detonating all at once. Brian pulled her onto his lap without breaking contact. Bed? He breathed against her mouth. Bed, she agreed. But at the edge of the mattress, they both stopped. Reality landed on them like cold water. Wait, London said, her breathing ragged. This changes everything. I know, Brian said. And tomorrow, London, I want you. I've wanted you since that ridiculous ethics class, but only if you want this too. She searched his eyes and found truth there. Desire, yes, but laced with something gentler. Affection, respect. I want to, she whispered. I think some part of me always did. But Brian, this doesn't mean, it doesn't have to mean anything beyond tonight, he murmured, kissing her again, slower this time. I know. Tonight you're mine. Tomorrow we go back to pretending we can't stand each other. Deal. They didn't sleep until dawn crept over the Manhattan skyline, and when London finally drifted off in Brian's arms, sometime around 6, her last hazy thought was that this had surpassed any fantasy she'd never had about him. Not that she'd ever admit to having fantasies about Brian Holman. Absolutely never. Chapter 3. The morning after. And moving in, London woke to Manhattan sunlight slamming directly into her face through enormous windows that apparently didn't come with blackout curtains because the bridal suite had been designed for people who enjoyed being assaulted by natural light at 6 in the morning. She blinked, trying to piece together where she was and why her body ached in ways that were distinctly pleasant, and then became aware of a heavy arm draped across her waist and a warm body pressed firmly against her back. Brian, asleep, slow, steady breathing against her neck. Oh God, London whispered to no one in particular as the previous night came flooding back in high definition. "What have I done?" "You had the best night of your life." Brian's voice came out rough and half buried in the pillow. His eyes were still closed, but he was clearly and infuriatingly awake, several times over, if I'm remembering correctly. London flipped around, knocking his arm loose and shoved his chest harder than strictly necessary. "I've been awake this entire time. Difficult to sleep soundly when someone keeps whispering, 'I shouldn't have done this,' every 3 minutes like a guilt-ridden prayer," Brian replied, finally opening those green eyes that glinted with insufferable amusement. "Good morning, by the way, wife." "Don't call me that." London scrambled for something to cover herself with, since she was wearing nothing but his dress shirt, grabbed blindly in the dark hours earlier. "We are, in fact, still legally married," Brian pointed out, stretching with the lazy satisfaction of a cat in a sunbeam. "So, good morning, my gorgeous wife, who is wearing my favorite shirt in a way that should probably be illegal." London seized the nearest pillow and launched it at his face with remarkable accuracy. Brian laughed, snatched it out of the air and hurled it right back, and somehow the whole thing devolved into a ridiculous pillow fight that ended with Brian pulling her back onto the mattress and locking his arms around her. "And where exactly do you think you're going?" he asked, holding her against his chest in a warm, annoyingly comfortable trap. "Bathroom," London said, struggling against him with minimal actual effort. "Shower. Pretend none of this ever happened. Room for one more?" Brian offered in a tone that left zero ambiguity about what would follow. "Absolutely not." London broke free and half sprinted to the bathroom, his laughter chasing her all the way. The shower was long, scalding, and gave her the space to confront the situation she'd wandered into. She had married Brian Holman, the man who'd spent 4 years making her life miserable, and then slept with him, and was now standing in his bathroom because they were, technically, legally bound to each other. Her life had become a bad sitcom, and she had no script for getting out of it. When she emerged wrapped in the plush white robe the hotel provided, Brian was already dressed, jeans, black t-shirt, and tinkering with the espresso machine that the suite apparently included, because nothing in this place was simple. The rich smell of fresh coffee filled the room, and London's stomach growled loudly, betraying the fact that she hadn't eaten anything real since the wedding. "Coffee?" Brian held out a small porcelain cup of something dark and fragrant. "Please." London took it and drank, burning her tongue and not caring because the caffeine was worth the pain. They stood in easy silence for a few minutes, sipping coffee, watching Manhattan stir to life through the glass, and London almost managed to convince herself this was a normal morning until Brian's phone erupted on the coffee table with aggressive persistence. "Jared," Brian said, glancing at the screen before answering. "Morning." "Yeah, still breathing." "No, she didn't murder me, not yet anyway." He paused, listening, and his expression shifted from relaxed to tense in the space of a breath. "Wait, they did what? When?" London's stomach clenched. That tone promised nothing good. Brian looked at her with a mixture of concern and something that resembled regret. All right, thanks for the heads up. Yeah, I'll tell her." He hung up and set the phone down with deliberate care. "What?" London asked, dread climbing her spine. "Brian, what happened? Remember when I said we'd annul this on Monday, no big deal?" Brian rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit London was beginning to catalogue. "Yes, turns out there's a complication. Actually, 2 major complications, both with consequences I didn't anticipate." "What complications?" London set her cup down before her shaking hands could drop it. Brian exhaled slowly. "My grandmother, Eleanor Holman. She's wealthy, she's controlling, she's ferociously traditional, and there's a clause in her will I don't inherit my share unless I'm married and settled by the time I turn 33. "Okay." London didn't yet see where this was heading. "And I turned 33 in 3 months. Brian continued, and my entire family saw the wedding. On social media, every cousin, aunt, and uncle, because half the guests posted videos and photos. My grandmother is apparently overjoyed that I finally settled down. She wants to meet you this week." The implication hit London with the force of a freight train. No, Brian, that is your problem, not mine. "There's more," he said, raising a hand. "Jared did some digging. He was curious about why Brandon bolted, and he found something." "Something like what?" "Something like Brandon was having an affair," Brian said, watching her carefully, "with Melissa Parker, your colleague. It's been going on for months. They're officially together now, and on top of that, they're threatening a lawsuit." London felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Melissa? Melissa from my office? The woman I mentored? That's the one," Brian confirmed, and the anger in his voice was genuine. "And why would they sue me?" London's voice hit a register she didn't know she had. "I didn't do anything. Because you married someone else on the day you were supposed to marry him," Brian explained. "Their version of events is that you and I were carrying on an affair the entire time, and that you publicly humiliated Brandon by marrying your secret lover in front of everyone. They're casting him as the victim." "That's insane." London began pacing the room like something caged. "I never had an affair. I hadn't spoken more than 10 words to you in 3 years before yesterday. I know that." Brian said evenly. But it's his story against ours, and Brandon can be persuasive when he wants to be. Plus, the fact that we got married hours after he disappeared plays right into the narrative that something was already happening between us. London sank onto the sofa because her legs had stopped cooperating. This can't be real. This is a nightmare. Brian sat beside her and took her hand in both of his. London, hear me out. I have an idea. No, London said instantly. You haven't even heard it. Any idea that comes with that look on your face can't possibly be good. Fair point, he conceded with a faint smile. But listen anyway. What if we keep this going? 3 months. Be my wife. Not just legally, but publicly. Dinners, appearances, family events. Convince my grandmother this is real. Brian, that is absolutely more insane than marrying me yesterday in front of 200 strangers. He had an irritatingly valid point. Think about it. I need this for the inheritance. You need this to protect your reputation and defend yourself against Brandon's ridiculous lawsuit. It works for both of us. And after 3 months, London asked, even as she felt herself already sliding toward the lunatic proposition, we divorce, irreconcilable differences, split whatever assets need splitting, which is essentially nothing since we won't actually be combining finances, and go our separate ways. Brian delivered this like he was outlining a quarterly business strategy. Oh, and I'll give you half the inheritance. I don't want your money, London objected. Then I'll donate it, in your name, an orphanage, a children's hospital, whatever cause matters to you. But London, I need this, and you need protection. My legal team is sharper than anything Brandon can afford, more aggressive, more expensive. If you're legally my wife, they represent you too. London should have refused. It was the sane, responsible, self-respecting choice. But the image of facing a lawsuit alone, while Brandon and Melissa played the happy couple, made something hot and furious flare inside her chest. Where would I live? Brian's smile told her he knew he'd already won. My loft in Tribeca. Plenty of room, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, views of the river. You'd have the guest room. Separate bedrooms, London stressed. This is not a real marriage. Of course, Brian agreed, though the glint in his eyes suggested he gave the separate bedroom arrangement a very short life expectancy. Entirely separate, completely platonic. And rules, London pressed, shifting into negotiation mode. I want clearly defined rules. A lot of them. Boundaries, expectations, all of it spelled out. Whatever you say, wife. That smile again, the one that always short-circuited her composure. You set the terms, I follow them. Simple. 3 months. London said, her voice firm. Exactly 3 months, and then this is over. 3 months. Brian extended his hand. London stared at it for a long beat, fully aware that she was about to do something certifiably insane for the second time in 24 hours. But the alternative was facing the wreckage alone, and at least with Brian she'd have an ally who seemed to genuinely want to help, even if his motives were partly self-serving. She clasped his hand and shook it. Deal. But I swear, Brian, if you make me regret this, you'll destroy me using some creative combination of legal expertise and pure fury. He finished, pulling her into a brief hug. I know, you've made that threat roughly 15 times since we met. 17, actually, London corrected, but she was smiling in spite of everything. You make me insane. It's a gift, Brian replied. Now come on, we need actual breakfast, and then we need to figure out how to convince my grandmother that we're a couple madly in love and not 2 idiots who got married on a whim to save you from public disgrace. Somehow that sounds even worse out loud, London muttered, but she let him steer her toward the kitchen area where he picked up the room service menu. Pancakes or waffles? Brian asked, scanning the options. Both, London answered, because if she was going to live an elaborate lie for the next 3 months, she was at least going to do it on a full stomach. And bacon, a lot of bacon. That's my wife, Brian said with genuine approval as he dialed room service. And so London Preston, meticulous corporate lawyer who engineered every detail of her life with surgical precision, agreed to spend 3 months pretending to be happily married to the man who'd driven her crazy for years, all because the alternative looked worse. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, whispered the rational voice in the back of her mind, but London ignored it. She'd crossed the border of rational decisions a long time ago. Chapter 4. The Grandmother's Test and the ex who crawled back. Living with Brian Holman turned out to be surprisingly bearable, which annoyed London more than she cared to admit. She'd braced herself for non-stop domestic warfare and instead found that the man's habits were only partially intolerable. He left dishes piled in the sink after breakfast. Maddening. But he also made flawless coffee every morning without being asked, which was endearing in a way she refused to acknowledge out loud. He wandered around the loft shirtless after his morning shower, which, for reasons she declined to examine, obliterated her concentration. But he also respected her bedroom completely, never once crossing the threshold without an invitation, unexpectedly gentlemanly for a man who thrived on pushing her buttons. 2 weeks into their insane arrangement, London was realizing that Brian had a genuine talent for playing the devoted husband in public. He held her hand with effortless ease, called her babe in a voice that made her pulse jump even when she knew it was theater, and cooked full dinners on the nights she dragged herself home from the office looking like she'd barely survived the day. This is a performance, London told herself each evening as they sat on opposite ends of the sofa, watching Netflix with a carefully maintained gap between them. He's doing this for the grandmother, for appearances, to keep the whole story airtight. But it felt so convincingly real that she sometimes caught herself forgetting there was an expiration date printed on whatever this was. Dinner with grandmother Eleanor was set for Thursday evening at her Upper East Side apartment, and London spent the entire week mentally drilling herself on answers to every invasive question she could imagine. Brian, meanwhile, kept assuring her that his grandmother was completely harmless, just slightly terrifying and intensely judgmental, but nothing to worry about. Eleanor Holman was 85 years of concentrated scrutiny packed into a small, immaculate frame. When she opened the door, she examined London from crown to heels with the precision of someone inspecting questionable merchandise at an auction house. The apartment was exactly what London had pictured for a woman of old money. Antique furniture that probably cost more than most vehicles, paintings that belonged behind museum glass, and a general atmosphere of generational wealth and impossible standards. "So you're the one who finally tamed my grandson," Eleanor said, in a voice forged from decades of unchallenged authority. Yes?" London shot Brian a desperate look, silently begging for backup. He just smiled at her with warm, useless encouragement. "She's extraordinary, Grandma," Brian said, lacing his fingers through London's with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it for 2 weeks straight. "Brilliant sharp keeps me honest when I need it most." Eleanor replied, a single syllable loaded with unmistakable skepticism. She led them into a dining room set with porcelain that looked heirloom and silverware that was unmistakably real. "Sit. Dinner will be out shortly." The meal was prepared by a personal chef Eleanor apparently kept on permanent retainer, course after course of intricate French cuisine that London could barely taste through the knot of anxiety in her stomach as she waited for the interrogation she knew was coming. Eleanor probed into London's family, her career, how she and Brian had met. London answered everything truthfully, carefully editing out the 4 years of open hostility. Then Eleanor set her fork down with a deliberate clink that silenced the room and locked her gaze directly onto London's. "And what about love? Do you genuinely love each other, or is this a marriage of convenience?" The quiet that followed pressed down on London's chest like a physical weight. She opened her mouth with absolutely no idea what was about to come out, but Brian squeezed her hand beneath the table and spoke first. "I love her," he said. His voice was steady, his eyes on his grandmother, every trace of his usual humor stripped away. "Since college, I've loved London for years. I was just too much of a coward to say it until now." London turned her head so fast she nearly pulled something, staring at Brian's profile, processing his tone, the set of his jaw, the way every syllable landed with the weight of something completely sincere. No smirk, no deflection, no performance. Was he actually telling the truth, or was he simply so convincing that he'd fooled even her? Eleanor studied them both in a silence that stretched into what felt like geological time. Then, for the first time all evening, she smiled. "Good. We'll do this again next Thursday. Bring the marriage certificate. I want to confirm everything is legal and in order." They held it together until 10 o'clock, when they finally escaped the apartment. London lasted until the elevator doors closed before detonating. "So you told her you love me?" "Part of the act," Brian said, jabbing the lobby button with unnecessary force. "It did not sound like an act. It sounded completely real." "That's because I'm a good actor," Brian fired back, but his eyes were glued to the descending floor numbers, refusing to meet hers. "You're actually a horrific liar," London said, crossing her arms. "I always know when you're bluffing because you do that thing with your eyebrow." "I don't do anything with my eyebrow." "Yes, you do. You raise the left one by 1/2 centimeter when you're lying, and you did not do that up there." The argument continued to the car. It continued through the drive back to Tribeca. It was still going when Brian pulled into their building's garage, but there was something strangely familiar about it, almost comfortable in its friction, like they were a real couple having a real disagreement, not two people performing a relationship with a countdown clock. The following Thursday, London was buried in a complex contract at the office working late when a knock interrupted her focus. She glanced up expecting her assistant and instead saw the last person on earth she wanted to find in her doorway. Brandon Cooper. Grey suit, the one she recognized as his favorite, an expression attempting remorse but landing closer to cowardice. "London, we need to talk." Every muscle in her body locked. The pen in her hand froze mid-stroke. "You have the nerve to show up here." "I know," Brandon cut in, stepping inside and closing the door behind him without anything resembling permission. I know I was a complete coward, but we need to discuss what happened. There is nothing to discuss, London said, rising from her chair and putting the width of the desk between them like a barricade. You fled our wedding. You humiliated me in front of 200 people. Then you had the audacity to threaten me with a lawsuit. We are done talking. I made a mistake, Brandon said, and there was something in his eyes that might have been genuine, but London no longer trusted her own ability to read him. The thing with Melissa was weakness, nothing more. London, I love you, I always have. And this marriage to Brian, we both know it isn't real. Get out, London said, her voice low and edged. You don't love him, Brandon pressed, moving closer despite her tone. You love me, or you did. We can fix this, start fresh. You abandoned me at the altar, London nearly shouted, and her hands were trembling with fury. You spent months planning that wedding with me, let me agonize over every detail, and on the day that mattered most, you just vanished. I know, and I've been paying for it every single day since, Brandon said, closing the distance further. But think about it, London. Brian Holman, the guy you couldn't stand for years, that's not love, that's revenge. Or desperation. Maybe both. The words cut deep, because London had lain awake thinking exactly that during the first lonely nights in the guest room of Brian's loft, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd made a catastrophic error by agreeing to any of this. Leave, she repeated, but her voice wavered. Brandon reached out and touched her face with a hand that had once been familiar, but now felt like trespassing. Just think about what I'm offering. Real forgiveness. A genuine second chance. I'll wait, London. Whenever you're done pretending with Brian, I'll be right here. He left. London dropped into her chair because her legs couldn't hold her anymore. She pressed her face into her hands and fought to breathe through the panic swelling in her chest. Because Brandon was right about one thing, and only one. What exactly did she feel for Brian? Was it real? Or was it just rebellion against the pain of being abandoned? Was it love? Or was she clinging to the first person who'd offered shelter in her most vulnerable moment? Brian walked through the door at 8 that evening and knew immediately. London was on the sofa, staring through the window at nothing, a glass of wine in her hand that didn't look like it had been touched. What happened? Brandon came to the office, London said, her gaze still fixed on the glass. Brian went rigid. When he spoke, his voice was too measured, too controlled. Did he hurt you? Not physically. London finally turned to look at him. He just talked, said he still loves me, that the affair was a mistake, that he wants me back. Heavy silence. London watched Brian absorb the information, his face carefully blank, a mask that hid whatever was actually happening underneath. And you? He asked, each word placed with surgical precision. Do you want to go back to him? I don't know, London admitted, and something flickered behind his eyes. Pain, maybe, but it vanished before she could be sure. Brian, what is this? What are we? Because this started as a performance, and now I can't tell anymore what's real and what's pretend. London, he began. No, she said, standing and facing him squarely. Total honesty, right now. You told your grandmother you love me. Was that a lie to sell the story, or did you mean it? Brian dragged a hand through his hair, wrecking it further, and looked at everything in the room except her before finally exhaling. You want the full truth, even if it's messy and might blow this whole thing apart? Yes, I love you, Brian said, and this time his eyes were locked on hers. I've loved you since that ethics class where you handed me a sheet of paper and called me irresponsible in the same breath. I love you when you're impossible, and when you're being a relentless perfectionist. I love you when you pretend to hate me, but can't help laughing at my dumb jokes. And marrying you, even under completely absurd circumstances, was the easiest decision I've ever made, because some part of me has always wanted exactly this. London couldn't get enough air. Her heart was hammering so hard, she was certain he could hear it across the room. But if Brandon is what you want, Brian went on, stepping closer, if you believe he can make you happy and you can forgive what he did, I won't hold you to this. 3 months was the deal. If you want out early. London grabbed the front of his shirt and kissed him before he could finish. She poured everything she couldn't articulate into it, every tangled feeling, every sleepless night, every question that had no clean answer. When they finally broke apart, gasping, she murmured against his mouth, "Stop talking. Is that a yes?" Brian asked, pulling her closer. It's an I love you too, and it terrifies me, and I have no idea what to do with it, but I don't want Brandon. I want you. The words tumbled out in a single breathless rush before she could lose her nerve. That works perfectly, Brian said, and kissed her again. They went to his room this time, not hers. When the door closed behind them, London knew with absolute certainty that none of this was fake anymore. Not performance, not pretending. It was real, completely, undeniably real, and she was finally done fighting the inevitable. Chapter 5. The Vows That Mattered at Last. A month later, London was at her desk reviewing a contract when Ava exploded through the door without knocking, phone in one hand and a look of total disbelief on her face. "Turn on the TV, right now. Ava, I'm in the middle of—" "Now, London!" Ava was already lunging for the remote, flipping on the wall-mounted television before London could protest. The news filled the screen, and the image that appeared made London's pen slip from her fingers. Brandon Cooper was being walked to a squad car by police, hands cuffed behind his back, face twisted in unmistakable panic. "Urti arrested this morning on charges of financial fraud and money laundering," the anchor was reporting in a measured, professional tone. "Investigators allege that Mr. Cooper used personal relationships to construct a veneer of legitimacy while siphoning client funds through an elaborate embezzlement scheme." Melissa Parker, identified as both a romantic partner and an accomplice, was also taken into custody. London sank into her chair. Beside her, Ava had a hand pressed to her mouth in genuine shock. "He was using you," Ava said quietly. "London, the wedding, the relationship, all of it. It was cover, a way to look stable and respectable while he stole from people. If you'd actually gone through with marrying him, I'd be implicated," London finished, her stomach turning. "At the very least, I'd be under suspicion. My name would be tangled up in every headline." The realization hit her with sudden, staggering force. Brian hadn't just saved her from public humiliation that day at the altar. He'd shielded her career, her reputation, possibly her freedom, and he hadn't even known it. London grabbed her bag and was out of the office before Ava could finish objecting about the unsigned contract. She needed to see Brian. She needed to thank him. She needed to say the things she'd been too afraid to speak for weeks. The loft smelled like tomato sauce and garlic when she walked through the door. Brian was in the kitchen, apron around his waist, pots simmering on every burner, squinting at an Italian recipe on the tablet propped against the backsplash. He'd taught himself to cook Italian over the past few weeks, all because she'd mentioned once, offhandedly, that it was her favorite. It was absurd and completely wonderful. "Did you see the news?" London asked, dropping her bag on the sofa. "I saw," Brian said, turning to face her. "You okay?" "I'm perfect," London said, crossing the kitchen toward him. "I'm perfect because I didn't marry him. I married you." She wrapped her arms around him from behind and pressed her forehead against his back, breathing in the familiar scent of soap and something that was just distinctly him. "Technically, this is still a fake," Brian started, but London spun him around and pressed a finger to his lips. "It's not," she said. Her voice was steady and certain. "Brian Holman, I love you, for real, not out of convenience, not out of gratitude, not because you rescued me. I love you because you're infuriating and perpetually late, and you leave dishes in the sink every single morning, but you also know me better than anyone alive. You make perfect coffee without being asked and taught yourself Italian cooking to impress me, and you make me laugh on days when I should be falling apart." Brian's face softened into the genuine smile she'd grown to love, the one without bravado or deflection. "London Preston, technically Holman, are you proposing to me right now? We're already married, you idiot." "That one was fake," Brian said, taking both her hands. "So let's do it again. For real. Actual vows. Actual rings. No candy this time." "Yes," London said without a second of hesitation. "Let's do it right." 3 months later, London stood in the garden of Eleanor Holman's Upper East Side apartment. The grandmother had insisted on hosting the ceremony. "If you're going to do this properly, you'll do it in a respectable setting with respectable witnesses." When Brian had finally confessed the full truth about the emergency wedding, Eleanor had been delighted by the entire saga. Now she sat in the front row wearing a knowing smile, radiating the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd seen the ending long before anyone else. The ceremony was intimate, only the people who mattered most, and London wore a simple dress of white silk, nothing like the elaborate lace creation from the first time around. Brian was already standing at the altar when she arrived, and for once in his entire life, he was not late. London considered it a genuine miracle. When the moment came for vows, London took his hands and said the words that had lived inside her for longer than she'd ever admitted. "Brian, you saved my life on its worst day, and you haven't stopped saving it since. I love you, even when you drive me insane, especially when you drive me insane." Brian's eyes glistened, but his smile was radiant. "London, I've been in love with you since you handed me paper and called me irresponsible at 20 years old. It took me a decade to say it out loud, but every one of those years was worth it. You're my home, you always have been." The kiss drew applause from every chair in the garden. Ava was crying again, but this time the tears were purely joyful, no trace of the incredulous laughter that had marked the first ceremony. At the small reception that followed, Jared rose with a champagne glass and a grin that stretched across his entire face. To the couple that needed 10 years, 2 weddings, and a runaway groom to figure out what the rest of us saw from day one, "You two are the biggest idiots I've ever known, but you're idiots in love, and that's all that matters. Cheers." London danced with Brian under strings of warm light strung through the garden, and this time everything about it was real. No act, no deadline, no pretending. "No ring pops this time," she teased, glancing at the simple gold band on her finger. "I've got something better," Brian said. He held up his own hand, and there on his ring finger was a new tattoo, her initials, inked in elegant script. "You're completely out of your mind," London said, but her smile was so wide it ached. "Only about you," Brian answered, spinning her across the floor. "Always have been. Mrs. Holman." "Mr. Holman." "Thank you," Brian said, pulling her close, "for giving me the chance. Thank you for saving my life," London whispered. "Always," he promised. And in the city that never sleeps, two people who'd spent a decade pretending to be enemies finally surrendered. To the love that had been there all along, to the fate that kept throwing them together no matter how hard they resisted, to the obvious, undeniable truth that they were made for each other, even when they'd spent years insisting otherwise. It took 10 years, 4 years of college warfare, 3 years of silence, a runaway groom, and 2 weddings to get there. But every single second of the wait was worth it.